Good morning. My name is Iwunze Ugo, and I'm a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring findings from PPIC's report, Teacher Staffing in California, Assessing the Impact of Recent Spending. The report, technical appendix, and slides from today's briefing can be found on our website at ppic.org. This research and event are supported with funding from the Gates Foundation. We'd like to thank them for the support. For today's program, I will present some of the key findings from the report. I will then be joined by my colleagues Julien Lafortune and Brett Guinan for a discussion of key takeaways and to answer questions from our virtual audience. If you have a question, please send it with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support or endorse any political parties or candidates for public office. And now on to the presentation. The report takes a closer look at teachers, an obviously core component of the education that California students receive. We review the recent rise in state school funding, a lot of which went to teacher salaries and benefits, then go further to discuss trends and disparities in several teacher staffing metrics. These provide additional detail on not just what was spent, but what this funding actually bought and how that varies across districts throughout the state. Starting with some of the motivation, we know that there is a robust literature on the impact of teachers in education. Research has found that teachers are one of the most important educational inputs, having a greater impact on a wide variety of student outcomes than other factors. Personnel costs also make up a substantial share of district budgets. Teacher salaries and benefits far outweigh other expenditures like instructional materials, administration, and facilities maintenance. But spending is not the only thing. While the same money that pays for one teacher's salaries could pay for another's, there is variation across teachers in effectiveness and the kinds of impacts they can have for students. A lot of that is intangible and hard to measure, but research has found meaningful gains for students with teachers with more experience, training, and education. In addition to overall funding increases over the last decade, a lot of state policy has been directed toward adding more well-trained teachers to the workforce and supporting the further development of teachers that are currently working in California schools. Bringing us to the current context, I'll first point out that education funding in California has increased dramatically in the last 10 years. The voters approved Proposition 30, known during the campaign as the Millionaire's Tax in 2014, and more recently, there was a massive increase in state and federal funding in response to the pandemic. Funding has increased from just over $12,000 per pupil in the 2012-13 school year to more than $21,000 more recently. Greater revenues naturally lead to greater spending, as you can see in the figure here. You can also see where much of that spending goes. We break down total spending into salaries and benefits for both certificated and classified staff. The remaining gap to total spending includes things like materials, supplies, maintenance, and more. Certificated employees are any staff that are required to hold a certificate or a license as a condition of employment. This group primarily consists of teachers, but also includes other staff like librarians and school nurses. Classified staff, on the other hand, include other staff like teaching aides, clerical staff, and custodians. The figure shows that personnel accounts for most of the school spending of school districts in the state. Nearly half goes to certificated salaries and benefits alone, again, being teachers, and in total, roughly 80% of the district spending is on staffing. In addition to the recent revenue increases in 2014, California's education funding system was also overhauled with the Local Control Funding Formula, or LCFF. The new formula simplified the way revenues were allocated to districts and directed substantial amounts of new funding to those with greater shares of high-need students. Here, we see how spending changed for districts based on their shares of high-need students. Relative to districts where less than 30% of students were high need, we see that overall spending increased substantially for districts where more than 55% of students were high need, and even more for districts where high need student shares were above 80%. Overall, salary and benefits rose as well, but not by nearly as much. And moving to the right, we see that there weren't significant differences in spending on instructional salaries. These high-need districts did, however, receive substantial amounts of new funding. In the most recent year, per-pupil funding was about $5,000 higher for districts above 80% high need compared to districts where less than 30% were. The LCFF and Proposition 30 tax increases were part of the state's response to the improving economic conditions as California emerged from the Great Recession that began in 2008. Next, we look at teacher staffing metrics to show the impact of this funding. Starting with class sizes, we see that the student-teacher ratios were about 22 students to a teacher going back as far as 1999 before rising dramatically in 2010 as the recession led to funding cuts and significant reductions in the teaching workforce. Class sizes remained high for a few years until 2014, when funding increases led to expanded hiring. Student-teacher ratios have been declining since then and are now roughly 21 students per teacher. Looking at teacher experience, we focused on the share of teachers that are novice. That is, the share of teachers with less than 2 years of experience. Officially, novice teachers are often still in a probationary position where they receive additional developmental training while early in their careers, and research shows that the impact that teachers can have on student performance grows significantly in the first 3 to 5 years on the job. The trend here mirrors that for class sizes, with a steep drop during the recession and recovery over the last several years. We saw the shares of novice teachers drop during the recession because less experienced teachers bore the brunt of those workforce reductions. On the share of teachers that are fully credentialed, the trends were actually quite a bit different. Those shares were rising in the lead up to the recession and have remained at that high level over the last 2 decades. The data are missing from 2008 to 2012, however, so there may be a dip here that is not captured. I do want to point out the scale here, though. Most teachers in California are credentialed, and the shares have been high for quite some time. The rates were 85% as far back as the data go, and rose to 95% by about 2005, where they still sit today. We continue our analysis looking into differences across student groups, specifically low-income status, EL status, race, and ethnicity. Latino and white students have below average to average class sizes, while the typical Black or Asian students' classes are slightly larger. English learners and low-income students also have smaller classes than their peers. I'll note again, though, that these are very small differences, ranging from about 21.5 students per teacher to 22.5. The gaps are also small when we look at student group differences in the share of experienced and credentialed teachers. We have another teaching staffing metric here as well, whether teachers are in a clear assignment. This designation refers to whether a teacher holds a full credential and if they are formally authorized to teach their assigned course or subject or the special student populations in their class, like English learners or students with disabilities. The differences across groups in this measure are a bit larger, but still within 4 percentage points at the most. Though teacher staffing metrics don't differ much across student groups on average, when we focus on the schools with the greatest staffing challenges, we see significant demographic disparities. Comparing districts with the highest and lowest shares of teachers in clear assignments, we see substantial differences in their student compositions. In the schools where the most teachers are not in clear assignments, greater shares of students are low income, Black, or Latino. English learner shares are about the same across both groups, and there are fewer white and Asian students. We see similar patterns in the other teacher staffing metrics we analyze. This points to an interesting tension. While student group disparities across teacher staffing metrics are quite small overall, the places where these metrics are the most troubling also disproportionately serve students that have various other challenges. Stepping out to some of the takeaways from the report, we found that the recent funding increases led to much greater spending on teachers, though funding has shifted somewhat toward other purposes too. These funding increases improved teacher staffing metrics generally, but troublingly, the districts with the most significant challenges tend to disproportionately serve high-need students. Given that key finding, one of the policy takeaways is that responses meant to address teacher staffing issues will need a local, targeted approach. Though staffing metrics have improved, the range across districts can be substantial, and those with the greatest challenges could use extra support. Teacher pay, which we cover in the report, remains relatively low compared to other occupations that require similar levels of education and training. Increasing salaries could be a strategy to attract more and better trained teachers to the profession, especially in those with lagging district metrics. Further, while we were able to conduct this in-depth analysis with data from the California Department of Education, some of the analysis we would have wanted to do was beyond the scope of what was available. Teacher retention, for example, is a key metric that plays a role in both student achievement and the impact of district investments in staffing and development. More comprehensive data would allow researchers and policymakers to deeper insight into the impacts of funding and policy on teacher staffing metrics and ultimately on outcomes for California students. Now we'll expand out to a discussion of some more of the key takeaways before opening to the audience for a Q&A. I'd like to remind you, if you would like to ask a question, please send it along with your name and organization to our email address, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I'd like to now welcome our co-authors, my colleagues and our co-authors of the report, Senior Fellow Julien Lafortune and Research Associate Brett Guinan, to join me for a discussion of the key takeaways. Hi, Julian. Hi, Brett.
Hey, Iwunze, thank you.
Yeah, let's get started. So I figured we should start off with this. So we started the report off reviewing recent trends in state school spending. Funding per student has gone up quite a bit in the last decade or so, but then we saw there wasn't much movement in those teacher metrics. So Julian, did the LCFF not work?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think to unpack that a little bit, I want to talk a little bit more through what we did in the report, insofar as estimating the impact of LCFF. And so when we look broadly, we've seen that spending has gone up in all districts. Spending has gone up on teachers in in districts, just about every district on average. And so what we were looking at in terms of the effect of LCFF was kind of the relative impact in terms of those higher need versus those districts with fewer high need students. And that's where we found some differences, right? We found that, on average, even though higher need districts were also spending a lot more on teachers and instructional staff, they weren't necessarily spending more than the increase we saw in some of the districts that got less of these targeted dollars. So the targeted dollars, the kind of additional dollars that were, allocated to these high need districts seemed to go at least kind of on the margin towards things like support staff or other student services that aren't related to staffing, as well as kind of increasing pension and benefit costs. And so, we didn't see a lot of we didn't see a lot of movement on some of these teacher metrics. Now, that doesn't mean that LCFF didn't work or that these additional targeted dollars aren't working. And, when we actually look at the student level outcomes, across work that we've done as well as others, we have seen positive academic impacts from specifically these targeted dollars. Um, so given that we, targeted districts with these dollars and we gave them as well the flexibility, it could be that districts felt the need to use these dollars perhaps on other additional services, right? So not kind of classroom teachers, but support staff, which in part was part of the motivation for having some of these dollars to address, concentrated needs in districts and in schools. So again, it didn't move the needle perhaps on staffing metrics, at least in a relative sense across districts, but again, the evidence on student outcomes seems pretty positive, and it could be that districts are choosing to allocate or did choose to allocate these districts, differentially across a, broader set of student services.
Yeah, great points. You mentioned salaries, and another thing that we note in the report is that teachers tend to earn less than other professionals with similar levels of education and training. That can be a challenge in terms of encouraging college students to consider a career in teaching, and is often to blame for district struggles with retention. There are gains to experience, though. Teachers who work more years do see their salaries rise over time. Also, teachers with more education, earning a master's degree before becoming a teacher or while they're working, see higher earnings as well. The competitiveness of starting salaries, though, is the real challenge. Teaching is hard work, and further layering on this sort of financial sacrifice often proves to be too much for a lot of people that would otherwise pursue the career.
One other thing I want to add too, not to kind of go too deep on this point, but we did look, and in the presentation and the report, most of what we looked at were kind of broad spending and teacher metrics. We did look at salaries in terms of the impact that LCFF had on salaries and these kind of targeted dollars. And we found sort of some modest and small to mixed findings. So it looked like on average, teacher salaries were slightly higher in these higher need districts that got additional funding post LCFF. But we didn't see much of a difference in starting salaries. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, and so we think that's an important topic for future research. But at least when we kind of looked at it in a very broad sense, we didn't see too much movement there, even though we did see kind of average salaries go up, across the state during this time.
So Brett, I mentioned clear assignments briefly in the presentation. This idea that teachers are not just fully credentialed, but additionally, they're formally authorized to teach a particular subject. And could you talk a bit more about what we find in terms of how common it is to see teachers not in clear assignments, both in general and across subjects? And then maybe even expand a bit and describe what it means for students when their teacher isn't trained in their class subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Thanks, Iwunze. Yeah, so as you mentioned, to try to get at this kind of teacher subject match, we look at clear assignments as our main metric. Though I'll caveat that while we can look at clear by subject, we can't disaggregate by special student population, and a teacher's credential has to be appropriate for both the subject and the student group that they're teaching in order to be considered clear. We also limit this to secondary schools since most elementary classes aren't subject specific. And similar to the analysis that you showed, Iwunze, we find very similar or small differences in the share of teachers in clear assignments across subjects at schools, median students. So more than half of students are at a school where 83 to 86% of their teachers are in a clear assignment across subjects. But there are some subjects that have significantly greater staffing challenges. Specifically, we see that 10% of students attend a school where less than half of their math teachers are in a clear assignment, and it's about 40% when we look at science. To your last question about kind of what this means for students, there is research to suggest that teachers who are certified to teach in a given subject have a greater positive impact on student outcomes, particularly in science and math. So it's notable that these are the subjects where it's most likely to see that teaching assignment isn't clear.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail there. I mean, it's not just teachers per se, but what they teach, and the report really gets into a lot of those details. To wrap up some of this discussion before we throw it to the Q&A, let's think a bit about how much does this all matter? How about we try and go around and put some of these findings into the broader context? What should someone take away from the report? Brett, how about we start with you and to go around?
Thanks, Iwunze. Yeah, I would just emphasize one of the points that you already touched on during the presentation. There's some nuance in the data when we consider disparities in teacher quality that different student groups are exposed to. So we thought about this in the report in 3 different ways. We first compared kind of teacher quality staffing metrics at the schools attended by the average student in a group compared to those attended by the average student not in that group. For example, looking at schools attended by the average low-income students compared to those attended by the average non-low-income student. And as you showed, the differences in metrics across each group on average aren't large, and the shares of teachers meeting each metric of quality, so fully credentialed, clear assignment, not novice, they're pretty high overall. So we also looked at staffing metrics at schools with the highest concentrations of each student group. So top quartile of low-income student enrollment compared to those in the bottom quartile of low-income student enrollment. And gaps in teacher quality are similarly modest here. Where we did see the notable differences is when we compared schools with the largest and smallest staffing challenges. So those kind of like hardest to staff schools. And I think that this really gets at the importance of targeting. It may be that policy interventions for specific schools with more significant staffing challenges might be more effective than broad statewide solutions. What about you, Iwunze? What takeaways are you thinking about from the report?
Yeah, so I mentioned that teachers have a significant impact on students, of course, but what specifically, right? Is it about teachers that matters? The strongest findings in the literature on teacher impacts points to experience. Teachers get better and better at helping students grow as they learn on the job. And the effects are larger for the first 3 to 5 years on the job or so, but still continue growing even after that, right? So other things like training, getting a full credential, earning an authorization to teach a particular subject can make a teacher more effective in that first year. But staying and growing are key. Districts that are able to retain teachers, see them develop their skills and have these kinds of impacts on students. And whether that's through working conditions, developmental opportunities, or salaries, making it easier not just to become a teacher, but to stay a teacher seems like it could have pretty substantial effects.
Yeah, I guess just to wrap up on that, and given the importance of these kind of teacher characteristics and importance of teacher quality, and the research that you mentioned, Iwunze, I think just kind of echoing Brett a bit on how we target these dollars, and that broadly we've made a lot of progress, especially since the recession. Class sizes or student teacher ratios have gone down and are now kind of below where they were before. Clear credentials have gone up, and as well as kind of the share credentialed has gone up over time. So there's a lot of broad progress. But at the same time, when we're looking at these hard to staff schools, it really does suggest that there are some additional kind of strategies that need to go beyond funding formula policies or kind of broad funding increases. So that's kind of, I think, my big takeaway here. LCFF didn't necessarily move the needle from a relative sense on kind of addressing some of these hard to staff issues, but it's also not necessarily a policy that was designed to do that. And so if we do want to kind of hone in on some of these places where we are seeing the challenges, and in particular subjects like math and science where it's hardest, I think that's where kind of a more nuanced policy will be necessary.
Yeah. Thanks, Julian. Let's open up this discussion a bit to the audience Q&A. Again, I'd like to remind you in the audience, if you would like to ask a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. Thank you. Let's get started. So our first question comes from Janet in Sacramento. While we saw increases in various in funding and various teacher staffing outcomes in recent years, how does California compare to other states in things like class size and teacher pay?
Yeah, I guess I can. So if we look at the national data here, and there's a couple different national sources, they're generally aligned. California is pretty much at the top in terms of students per teacher. So I guess at the bottom, if we're thinking about, smaller classes are better. It depends year to year, but some, kind of the high, much higher classes. So we're looking at about 21, 22 students on average, depending on the source in California. When you look nationally, it's about 15 students per teacher, so a lot lower. On the other hand, though, we're also, our average teacher pay is a lot higher. And so we have, depending on the measure, we're either kind of the top or in the top 5 of average teacher pay. Again, that's kind of reflecting, cost of living and other kind of cost pressures in California, but that's definitely, kind of the broad pattern is we have, higher paid teachers as well as kind of smaller class or larger class sizes. And that's, that kind of trade-off, if it is one, is done a little bit differently in different states.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's, like the report gets into, there's this tension, right? You could have just more teachers, and obviously smaller classes, or to the extent that pay tracks with quality, right? You can have fewer, better teachers. And, there are different strategies, right, that districts can take in order to, again, do what we're all trying to do, right? Help California students achieve and reach their full potential. We've got another question here from Terry Sforza from the Orange County Register. Your research, and she asks, your research seems to suggest that paying teachers more while keeping class sizes the same does little to improve the learning environment. Should California consider funding more teachers with smaller class sizes in the highest need areas? Research has shown that leads to better outcomes. What's stopping us from doing that here?
Yeah, I guess to take the first stab at this, I mean, we do find that class size or student teacher ratios have improved over time. We don't necessarily see that is kind of a differential improvement in, say, higher versus lower need districts. So the kind of relative difference and the extra funding that we gave under LCFF doesn't seem to be moving that metric very much. So if we're kind of if we're focused on, kind of getting more teachers in these high needs kind of schools and districts, I do think that there probably are some other policies that are needed. But at the same time, taking a step back, we have still seen positive impacts of these targeted dollars under LCFF in these districts that got a lot of the additional funding. I mean, there's still kind of this broad trend and kind of broad academic movements that are concerning, especially post-pandemic when it comes to lagging test scores. But in terms of just like trying to isolate the impact of the funding changes that we've had, even if it hasn't really changed the kind of teacher characteristics that most students are exposed to, in these districts that got a lot of the additional funding, it did improve their outcomes. So I think that, a lot of educators would say there's other factors as well that we need to consider and other support services that are needed in schools. And I guess we've done, the data seem to suggest we've done a good job at that. How do we kind of tackle the next part about getting, much smaller class sizes or perhaps, more experienced, more credentialed teachers, especially in these kind of hard to staff schools that have more of these high, for kind of disproportionately high need, that's kind of the real challenge, I think, looking forward.
Yeah, yeah. And just to add to that, right, we find in the report, right, those funding differences are real. And we did target funding to these high need districts. And, looking at the specific targeted groups, both low income students as well as English learners, we see that on average, they have, lower average class sizes than typical sort of non-low income or non-English learner student. But then also when you look at those districts, right, what they're spending the money on, it points to, these resource challenges, right? It's not, of course, teachers are important. Having more teachers in smaller class sizes is important. But we saw those districts spending more in other areas too, whether that's instructional materials, additional sort of ancillary staff, teachers' aides, things like that. And that points to the breadth of the challenges that are facing these high-need districts. Let's see, we've got another question here. This one comes to us from Roy and Merced, and he asks, let's see, here he says, He says, what does it mean for a teacher to be correctly assigned and credentialed? What are situations in which they aren't? Brett, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So this is kind of that clear assignment idea that we've already talked about. So a teacher is correctly assigned and credentialed if they have a full credential and are formally authorized to teach the subject and or the student groups in their class. So some cases where a teacher wouldn't be considered clear is if they are holding a short-term permit, so they're on an intern credential or an emergency permit, other kind of waivers like that. Or if they're teaching at a field, which would be like an English teacher who's teaching in a science class. And so again, this is a more specific measure of quality is how we think about it beyond just having a credential. Like, is it an appropriate credential for the actual students that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great point, right? And one other thing to know, one thing to add to that, we did some research, or we cited some research looking at special things like national board certification, additional things pointing to teachers' level of training and experience. And we do find that those things are related to teacher impacts, right? So this goes to that point about not just retention, but also development, right? The extent to which teachers can continue training on the job and focus on not just teaching for more years, but getting better, right? That really does seem to have does seem to reflect in terms of improved student outcomes. We've got another question here, unsigned, asking, let's see, about how do teachers matter for student success, and is a diverse teaching workforce important? And I'll take that one. So in the report, we look at data on teacher demographics, and there's been a lot of policy effort in this area too, right? Not just trying to expand the teaching workforce, but then also diversify the teaching workforce. And this is from findings related to things like student-teacher ethnic matching, for example. Having a student having a teacher that looks like you is bound to have some important effects. And so there's that, and then also trying to grow the workforce and have more teacher access, have more people access teaching. We've seen policy effort in that area, and then generally to the extent that we make the road to becoming a teacher easier, whether that's through loan forgiveness or other kinds of residency programs or things like that. And then also, making it easier to stay a teacher, through working conditions and, additional support, that grows the set of people who can become a teacher. And as that set of people gets bigger, you'll have hopefully a workforce that reflects the state students and has these kinds of beneficial impacts where, again, students can see themselves in their teachers and have that as extra motivation to push them towards their full potential. We got a question here as well from Jerry in San Diego, asking, could we talk a bit more about teacher retention and why that's important?
I mean, I guess I can just to take a first kind of stab at this, mindful of time. It's a key outcome that we weren't able to look at. So the way the data are set up and in the state, it makes it easy to look at things like average experience and student teacher ratios and novice teachers, but it's harder to get a sense of retention. And I think that's a key kind of stability metric when we're thinking about schools and how much turnover there is. And it's one thing to be kind of a new teacher or even an experienced teacher, but if you're schools are having to rely on kind of switching teachers over and subject instability, right? Maybe they have to switch a teacher to a subject that they're not credentialed or trained or experienced in. This is where we potentially have some more of these worries. And so it's definitely something that I think we would hope that there's more we can do on, and more to more just in the data that we can look at there, because kind of from anecdotal perspectives, we do see that there's different some significant challenges retaining teachers in some schools, but we don't have kind of comprehensive statewide data on that to date, at least.
Yeah, that's a great point. Another thing I'll add on retention that's really important, it gets to the impacts of district investments, right? Like if you're a district and you hire new teachers and you have these programs where you have development, where they're getting more certifications and additional training, that's all great. But then if they leave in 2 years, not only is the teacher gone, which has disruptions for students, but that investment is lost as well, right? And it really makes it hard for districts to make those improvements, right? So when we're seeing, districts, high-need districts getting more funding, if they put their funding in these areas and then they lose the teacher at the end, that is really lost, right? And it just really points to the impact of the challenges that we see across districts in terms of the students they serve. So we're here at time. We've reached the end of our program. I want to thank Julien Lafortune and Brett Guinan for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to thank our funders, the Gates Foundation, and thanks to you all for joining us online. We would appreciate you taking a moment to give us your feedback on this event. If you pre-registered for this event, you'll receive an email later today with a link to a short survey. But you can also scan the QR code on your screen right now. Finally, a recording of today's event will be available on the PPIC website and our YouTube channel soon, so you can watch it again or share it with your network. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon.